Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for those of you who stayed on. Thanks for those of you who came from elsewhere to join us for this morning's event. We just had a very interesting discussion this morning in this room, and in some degrees we're going to be following up on some of the themes that arose this morning. My name is Pierre Gratton. I'm President and CEO of the Mining Association of Canada. This is my second time at Mining Indaba. I was here last year, and it was sort of a bit of a reconnaissance mission to see if this is a place where the Mining Association of Canada should be on a more ongoing basis, representing our members' interests on the continent. And obviously we're here because the decision was yes. And we're very pleased to be having this session this morning, and that we've put together collaborating with the Government of Canada and its presence here. What we're going to talk about today is the whole issue of sort of community engagement and community benefits. And as we know, the mining industry is a significant wealth generator. In addition to well-paid jobs and taxes, the indirect spin-offs from mining are significant. It has been shown, for example, in Canada, that a single mine generates more wealth for our country than the entire West Coast fishery. It has been shown to be equivalent to holding the Winter Olympics. We in Canada think of Winter Olympics really because of all the snow and cold, every day of the year. So that's what a mine brings. So it's a single mine, to say nothing about the entire sector. But as we also know, local benefits from mining cannot be taken for granted. Unless the right strategies are put in place and acted upon, we can face very different outcomes. The so-called resource curse comes to mind. Today's mining industry, and certainly its leaders, now recognize that we have an obligation, as well as a strong business case, to work to ensure our communities where we operate benefit from and see the benefits from our activities. And we realize that to do this right, we need to engage actively with our stakeholders early and often. At the Mining Association of Canada, as part of our mandatory Towards Sustainable Mining initiative, we have worked hard to put community engagement at the center of what we do. TSM is a unique initiative that requires MAC members to measure on report against 23 different indicators, performance criteria in 6 areas, covering tailings management, biodiversity conservation, health and safety, energy and greenhouse gas management, crisis preparedness, and of course Aboriginal and community engagement. This reporting is done at the site level and is both independently verified and publicly reported. At the heart of TSM is a strong focus on encouraging meaningful engagement with the communities around which our mines operate, and each of the 6 areas contain requirements that focus on community engagement and consultation. Several of our members have implemented TSM, not just in Canada, where it's a condition of membership, but also at several of their international operations, including IAMGOLD and First Quantum. The International Council on Mining and Metals, of which we are an associate member, has similarly placed a central focus of their work on community acceptance, developing guidance on community development and engagement, now used by the world's leading mining companies around the world. So today we're going to explore these themes in a few ways. First, it's my pleasure to welcome 2 members of the Mining Association of Canada, one of whom is also a member of ICMM, Janina Gawler of Rio Tinto and Pascall of First Quantum, are here to highlight some innovative ways that they engage with communities in Madagascar and Zambia, respectively. It's also my pleasure to welcome Patricia Malikail, who is with the Government of Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs. Patricia is here to speak about Canada's recently published second edition of their CSR strategy for the extractive sector. This enhanced strategy, which we were very closely consulted on, contains several elements that will serve to help Canadian companies better understand what is expected of them, and also provides strengthened measures to help resolve disputes between companies and communities when they arise. So this strategy, too, puts communities in central focus. As the panel concludes, I'll be welcoming Greg Goldhawk, and I just want to say as an aside, but your last name is a mining company name, or if it's not, it should be. So you're really in the right place and in the right job. So I'll be welcoming Greg Goldhawk, the newly appointed head of office for Canada's Trade Commissioner Service in Johannesburg that provides services in most of Southern Africa, to make some closing remarks. So my hope is over the next hour and a half we'll hear about some interesting and leading-edge practices from our speakers, and we'll have time to get into some discussion. So with that, I'll introduce our panel. Matt Pascall from First Quantum is the Director of Operations and a founding member of First Quantum Minerals, and has overseen the company's business in Zambia since 1998. Under Matt's leadership, First Quantum has expanded from the Wana Makubra mine in Kansanshi and to Kansanshi mine and the Trident Development Project, while the company's copper production has gone from 10,000 pounds per year to 428,000 pounds in 2014. Mac will be speaking about the company's contribution to Zambia, specifically in the areas of town development, in-migration management, and most importantly, the company's commitment to education. Janina Gawler from Rio Tinto is the global practice leader for communities and social performance with Rio Tinto. Over the past 15 years, she's been involved in the development and implementation of the social performance programs across Rio Tinto operations. Most recently, she has been Director of Environment and Communities on the Simandu project, which is a large infrastructure and mining project in Guinea, developed in partnership with the Government of Guinea, Chalco, and the IFC. Janina and her team of specialized practitioners provide advice, assurance, and business support on resettlement, land acquisition, community engagement programs, and partnerships to ensure the long-term social license to operate for Rio Tinto. And lastly, Patricia Malikail is with the Department of Foreign Affairs, which she joined in 1981. She served in a long list of countries: Canberra, Beijing, Singapore. She led the team which formulated Canada's Least Developed Countries Market Access Initiative and managed a wide range of economic trade, investment, and security files for 8 G8 and APEC Leaders Summits and assisted Canada's G8 Sherpa. In 2011, she began serving as the Acting Director General of the Africa Bureau and held that position until she was appointed Director General a year later. Following the amalgamation of Foreign Affairs and CEDA, Ms. Malikail was appointed Director General of the Pan-Africa Bureau in May 2014. So with that, I'm going to first turn it over to Matt to provide some comments on their operations in Zambia.
There's always a need to lift these things up a bit.
Just made me feel short.
Thanks, Pierre. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Fortunately, I see that you have a copy of our document, Respect, there, which sort of does cover quite a lot of what we do on the CSR front. So I won't go into too much detail on that, but and we only have a few minutes to talk, and then obviously questions. But if we just look at CSR in broad terms, there are obviously a number of different, very different phases associated with that. There's that which is required during the prospect and project phase, and then obviously it does change quite significantly once you go into an operating mode. I think we're probably all aware that in that prospect and early years phases, the greatest possible impediment to projects going ahead is actually from not doing the community development side properly. And obviously Peru in particular sort of has had some headline events in the last couple of years where really significant mining projects have been, I guess by this stage, some of them even abandoned. because of the antipathy of the local community and just blocking them. And so fundamentally, to get a project off the ground, that work has to be done extremely thoroughly and taking into account all the requirements of principally the people living in the area. And obviously there are a lot of governmental and regulatory things that have to be taken care of, but the big issue is the people living in the area. Now, in Zambia, the Trident project, that was exactly the situation that we found, and the first requirement of that project was, in fact, to relocate 600 family units from their historic land holdings and livelihoods. And the way that we achieved that, I think in simple terms could be said that was by providing the people with a significantly better environment than what they had historically had. So it meant building better houses, providing better services in terms of clinics, schools, access in terms of road, and probably most importantly, a thing that we like to think that we've done quite well there is livelihood support. It's all very good moving somebody and putting him in another house if he then can't continue the livelihood that he either had previously or some, in fact, improvement on that. And so we'll come to it again later on. One of the things that we have done extensively in Zambia, and we hope that it's been a success, it's certainly well received and gets some traction in senior parliamentary circles, is what we call conservation farming, where we are able to bring in some experts who work with the local communities, develop their farming practices to an extent where instead of being subsistence farmers who basically continually destroy the land as they have to move on to new plots continuously as they degrade the environment they've been in, we've brought in practices that allow them to utilize the same piece of ground, the old rotating crops and so on, and getting up to 5 to 10 times the yields that they're used to. And as a result of that, a lot of these people, as I say, have moved from subsistence to actually generating disposable income. And so you've seen an influx of things like bicycles, radios, TVs, and the like. So that livelihood replacement has been a key ingredient in successfully moving those people off the area required for the mining. As I say, obviously, other aspects require that you go through the full regulatory requirements of the government, and that's probably the easy side. It's definitely the community issues that are the challenge, and that can block the progress of a project. Once the operation goes, or once the mine or project goes into operation, once the project actually starts and you start building, there's immediately a great expectation that the mining company is going to do a huge amount in social projects. Now, obviously, that's a time when the company is spending money at a huge rate and doesn't have any revenue to go with it. So the expectations of the community have to be managed through that period. Now, moving into basically what was virgin territory and just African bush, there was no accommodation, no housing units, no services available whatsoever. So fundamental in that time of building the project was also building a town. And in the first phase, over 1,000 houses have been built, and with those houses, and they're fully serviced, and that might not seem like a big deal to most people if they're from first world countries, but in Zambia, it's probably true to say that very few developments and expansions of old towns have carried with them the full servicing, i.e. power, water, sewage and the like. Now, this town that's being developed there has all those things built in. A first-class clinic, schooling, and the possibility of expanding that town up to 10,000 housing units, which would include municipal areas. At some point, this town will be handed over to a municipal authority to be controlled and managed in perpetuity. And sporting facilities, and as that town grows, provision has been made for more space for additional medical facilities, education facilities, and the like. And again, of course, associated with that, we are looking at developing other industrial or commercial activities, shopping centres, light industrial areas and the like. One of the impediments that we've had there has been that it has been extremely difficult to actually secure land title for the individual plots, and therefore it's not been possible to sell these plots to the workers or to anybody else who wants. It's an open town. And also, it's not been possible for these commercial enterprises to actually commit to building facilities when they don't have the collateral aspect that comes with land title that we take for granted in so many other parts of the world. And for wealth development in Zambia, and possibly through large parts of Africa, we believe it's absolutely fundamental that this issue to do with land rights and land title gets addressed. Some 90% of Zambia is still held by traditional leaders on behalf of the government. It means that 90% of Zambia has no collateral value. And when, I'm sure I can speak for many people in this room who may have started their careers with no assets whatsoever, and you buy a house using the value of the house as collateral for the loan because you don't have the cash. And from there, that's often people's first step up the ladder of wealth creation. That avenue doesn't exist for most people in Zambia, and I think our belief is that's absolutely fundamental. And so the view that we sell houses at a subsidized cost to our employees, to some might seem like an anathema, but we believe that's absolutely fundamental for those people to take that first step in their ability to create wealth. Once the project goes into an operation phase, then the whole emphasis on CSR really changes again. The mine is now hopefully generating revenue and profit, but I think maybe it's an opportune time to be speaking to it because metal prices are not great at the moment, and a lot of mines are taking a lot of pressure, and their survival is actually in question in a lot of cases. So we believe, or maybe I should say I believe, that really the most important thing that a mining company can do, and its fundamental requirement, is to stay in business. If a mining company closes down, it loses entirely the ability to employ people and thereby distribute wealth to not only its direct employees but all the people associated with that mining operation. As Pierre says, what a single mine in Canada brings to the economy is absolutely huge. Obviously, if it stops working, all of that stops as well. So before it looks at anything else, it has to stay profitable. Again, Zambia and DRC and in fact many other countries went through a period in the late 20th century, 1970s through to 2000, where a lot of the mines were owned by state corporations. Now, we often get told that when ZCCM was running the mines in Zambia, that they did a tremendous job on CSR, and that couldn't we as a mining company do the same sort of thing? We believe that rearview mirror is actually being seen through rose-tinted glasses. I was personally involved in looking at all the mines except Concola to do due diligence during the privatization program. And quite frankly, those mines were in a shocking condition, and what was supposed to be a CSR program, in many cases, were very poor. The hospital, Wusikili in Nkana, you would go there to die, not to get better. The facilities had broken down completely. Now, people looking back on it always think it was great. But if at the end of the day, one could truly say that the miners working there were subsistence miners. Their salaries left them with no disposable income, and to the extent that they were required to work, the mine provided them with 25 kilograms of mealie meal a month and a half a loaf of bread a day. And a lot of them used to take that loaf of bread underground with them, take it out of the mine, and give as their only sustenance for their families. So, and of course the other issue that is worth bearing in mind is that those mines were losing $1 million a day, and that was being funded by the donor community through the government of Zambia. And it was only at some later stage that the World Bank drew a line under that the privatization process was initiated, and obviously from then on, that $1 million a day loss was picked up by private sector rather than the government. So the mines, to the extent that they were providing CSR in any form, were actually doing it with money that was which was Zambian money. It wasn't the mines' money. It was money being lent to Zambia, and in the process it was impoverishing the whole of the Zambian country, to just look after the people in the mining industry. That seems really a backward way, or a back-to-front way, that process should work. The second most important thing that mining company can do is to pay taxes, fair taxes. In Zambia, again, the mining industry continually gets accused of somehow or other hiding its revenue and thereby paying too little in the way of taxes. And we now have introduced, or the government has introduced, a mining royalty tax because apparently that's going to be easy to administer. Unfortunately, it's already probably seen the end of Barrick's Lumwana mine as being completely unsustainable. What we've challenged the government on a number of occasions to please do is please find which perpetrator, that you're only talking about 5 big mining companies, who's stealing all this copper. It's not something that you can take out in your jacket pocket. It's got to go out in truckloads. In fact, 20 truckloads a day is the rate that it's apparently being stolen. Obviously that's not the case, and it's just become a convenient whipping boy to blame economic woes on, is to blame the mining industry for somehow stealing this copper, and therefore the tax rates just keep getting ratcheted up. And even before the mineral royalty tax regime, Zambia had the highest tax regime in the world, something close to 50%, and it's just being expected to balance the Exchequer's books, which is obviously can't continue, and it'll see the demise of the long-term requirements of those mines. Kansanshi has paid close to $3 billion in taxes in the last 6 years. At some times that tax payment has been running at about $1.5 million a day. I think that's probably more than most mining companies do, and this is up to 20% of Zambia's total tax take comes out of one mine. The next important thing for mines to do is to operate safely and environmentally soundly. Obviously they have to do that at all stages, even while they're making a profit and so on. Kansanshi's just gone through 8.5 million fatality-free shifts. For those of you in the mining industry will know that that's a hell of an achievement. As far as environmental issues, we take that is very well regulated in Zambia, and they apply the highest standards. Those are the World Bank, IMF and so on. And it's absolutely fundamental that the mines operate environmentally friendly. And in fact, we have some of our environmental people here if anybody wants to ask them specific questions about that. Just one point on the environment or environmental issues. Mining industry always, again, gets hammered worldwide for its environmental record. But it might just be of interest to know that the footprint of all the mines in the world is less than the footprint of the car parks of Walmart in the States alone. Now, if anybody can tell me that a parking lot is an environmentally friendly structure, I'd debate it. So, but nobody complains about the car parks. One of the problems, of course, of just paying tax is that it's not necessarily that those taxes come back and benefit the community in which the mine operates. And that's really where our CSR programs in Zambia kick in. And we, by necessity, have to do a lot of things in the regions that we operate to take care of that shortfall. And after a number of iterations on how we could go forward with CSR that was meaningful for the community, you always found there were conflicting requirements or conflicting desires from different community bodies. And if you try to prioritize those, sure as anything, somebody got left off the list, and he therefore objected to your CSR program. So what we have really concentrated most of our efforts on is in the education field. And in that light, we look at education and creating schools and assisting schools from preschool level throughout schooling, university scholarships. We run the artisan training program entirely in Solwezi. We've built the facilities, we provide the lecturers. There's been a huge depletion of the artisan or training skills and therefore the competency, and that we believe is absolutely a fundamental requirement for the country to go forward. As I said earlier, we do this conservation program, farming program on both our mine sites, and we have just over 2,000 farmers currently involved. We also run farming training programs, and so far over 5,000 people have come from all over Zambia to participate in a 3-day intensive farming practice improvement program. So, and we believe one of the requirements for this, for our mines, is when they close down, that everything in the vicinity doesn't close down with it. And if one builds infrastructure and it's not properly maintained, it will all degrade. And one saw that in Zambia through the decades after 1970, that the infrastructure did degrade. And that's why another reason why we've concentrated on education is it doesn't matter what happens once those mines close down. The one thing you can't do is take away somebody's education. And hopefully the people who benefit from that education will be the next generation that will be there to take the country forward. Finally, obviously, in Zambia, one of the other things that we do concentrate a lot of effort in because of the nature of where we operate is on the health side. Again, we think a lot of the health issues will be taken care of if people are better educated. But endemic there obviously been AIDS and malaria. And so we've had very extensive programs to mitigate malaria and try and assist the community to get rid of the AIDS scourge. And that program has been particularly successful. And if one looks at the rates of onward transmission in the areas that we operate, they've reduced significantly over the last 5 or 10 years. So thanks very much. That's and happy to take any questions later when you guys, and as I say, I've got a number of people, allies here, to answer them. Thanks. Yeah.
Can we go now to you?
So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I think Matt's probably covered quite a wide range of the experiences that we have across each of the project areas that we work, but I might just draw some linkages from our experiences both in Canada and here in Africa. Obviously, we're a large global company, operations, Australia, the US, Canada, Our second largest investment is in the Canadian, within Canada, and the extraction of minerals and processing. We operate across a number of mineral areas: aluminium, iron ore. Here in South Africa, we have an ilmenite operation in Richards Bay. We have interests in energy in South Africa as well as in Namibia and in Madagascar. What Pierre asked was to look at the linkages between the experiences we've had in Canada and perhaps the investments and the work that we've undertaken in South Africa and in Madagascar, and I'll speak a little on the Simandou project as well, which is in Guinea. And since my responsibility in the Rio Tinto Group is particularly around community standards and the implementation of those programs across the business, I can go into a little more detail, and I'm happy to take questions during the course of the discussion. I think if I profile some of our learnings out of Canada, particularly in the Diavik mining operation, which is a pristine environment, Northwest Territories, and the development of a diamond mine, in an environment that is quite physically hostile, but one in which I think from the Canadian government's point of view was an opportunity to grow a diamond industry, and we're certainly the second mine that was developed in that area. It was because of the strong partnerships that were developed in that location, and indeed some of the legislative requirements of our engagement in that location, that we forged very strong opportunities with Northerners and also with Aboriginal communities, which I think have informed our practices more broadly worldwide. And we've taken those through our Australian operations with our strong relationships at the local community level, and reflected those in the implementation of communities programs with our long life operations in Madagascar, in Richards Bay Minerals, and is the fundamental framework in which we're operating with Simandou. I think the construct around partnerships, which are in fact contractually binding in the Canadian situation, impact benefit agreements, go for the life of the operation. They have a clear commitment to a payment stream on impact, investment in employment, investment in small business development, in training and development to give people an opportunity to participate. In the Canadian situation, more than $4 billion over 14 years have gone into northern development and benefits that have been paid into supply lines and employees, and particularly about half of that has gone into Aboriginal businesses. That's a very strong platform, and my experience recently in working with the Canadian businesses was to see that platform being then built for opportunities for the Canadian, for the First Nations groups to be then involved in other mining operations which were being developed in that region. So there's quite a substantial growth, I think, De Beers has opened up as well. Taking that experience and looking at the way in which we've developed the Madagascar operation at Fort Dauphin, it's a joint partnership between Rio Tinto and the Madagascar government, and on the development of the port, have worked with the World Bank on a tripartite partnership for public-private partnership development to enable the growth opportunity out of that port. We also sit in an environmental, an area of significant environmental concern. It's a very highly biodiverse area, ensuring that environment is maintained and is protected as part of our sand mining operation. It's not an easy piece of work, but it's very strong investment in environmental development along with local people. The comment that Matt made on resettlement I think is really important, because many of these operations do require resettlement, and the fundamental platform from which we've built our resettlement work is around working to ensure that social harmony continues. Now that's not an easy situation when people are being asked to move. The really critical issue is what happens beyond the move, and the food security, the benefit that comes from improved farming techniques and support for the growth of a cropping industry that provides more than just the family's subsistence and goes into opportunities for export. Not necessarily easy in an environment where you see significant change with either political environments or alternatively as we're a situation that we have currently in Guinea, where we've had to manage through Ebola. But I think the fundamentals continue irrespective which is strong respect for local communities, an expectation of building them into the business. It's not just a case of communities and social performance being a standard that sits on the side and a group of community practitioners working on that. The work that we undertake from a Rio Tinto perspective is to build that as being the business of the business. And we touch communities in a number of ways in our operations on a day-to-day basis, as employees, potential employees and their families, in terms of small business supply, and then the work associated with the day-to-day engagement on the impacts, whether the truck driving past has impacted on the particular family, whether we've got dust issues, whether grievances are rising out of historic behaviours. All of those are matters that have to be managed within the everyday operation, and we expect from a global practice point of view, and in fact the board's perspective, is that these are part of ensuring our continuing social licence to operate and working through the highs and lows of the economic cycle. And certainly that's where we are at the moment. We've seen that significant change, and the challenge that then brings if communities have very high expectations for us to act in the role of government, potentially around the provision of education, health programs and so on. And the way in which we've addressed those is around partnerships with NGOs and looked to the civil society capability building to ensure that that structure is in place for the long term for communities, so that beyond our mining operations, and many of our operations are 50 years, the people are better off than they were at the time that we first became part of that relationship. I might touch a little on the experiences we've had in Simandou more recently, because as you'd be aware, the Ebola epidemic has had a very significant impact in the West African communities. From a mining point of view, we're part and parcel of life in that community. Our operation currently is a project, potentially one of the largest projects. Any one of the three elements of that project would be very significant. A large port, 650 kilometres of rail corridor, which will require resettlement of about 350 households, so quite a number of families, and a large mine, potentially 100 million tonnes of iron ore a year. We've worked extensively with the communities on malaria, much as any other mining company would have undertaken, HIV/AIDS education, cholera management and sanitation. The real challenge came with Ebola, because we're all out in the field. It's part of the current program, is the land acquisition, particularly with communities and early works on infrastructure. We've been very fortunate to date that none of the employees of the Simandou project, there are over 1,000 employees, all their families have been touched by Ebola. Now, that doesn't in any way take away from the incredible impact of Ebola right across the communities and the work that's been necessary to work with governments and the World Health Organization to try and mobilise people's understanding of the challenge. It is very confronting, and from a mining point of view and from a project point of view, we've continued to pay our employees, but in terms of our capacity to actually operate, is limited until we can actually see a change in what's happening. And we're seeing some improvement, certainly. Mobilising resources, logistical support, and ensuring that we're supporting government and other agencies has been built on a long relationship. It's not easy, I think, to step forward when you've often got a lot of logistical support, but not to be seen to be taking over. It's a part of building capacity. And I think through the recent work that's been undertaken, a sense of building trust, that we can support families, we can support the communities across this very vast footprint, has been built as a result of a long relationship. The real challenge, I think, comes as we move into the post-Ebola strategy, which will be on the development of food security, and we've made substantial investment with a number of NGOs specifically to address that. And that's not in any way to suggest that this is an easy space, but it's one of the waves, I think, that mining projects and mining operations have to go through, and how we need to be really open and transparent about the challenges that we have. Matt mentions the expectations. People's expectations are that coming in for a job, there will be thousands of jobs. Realistically, to run the mining operation at the mine, along the rail corridor and the port, probably at full operation will be 4,000 people, which is a relatively small number. Multiplier effect, yes, probably that number of suppliers will be substantial. To construct it, 18,000 people, and that'll be over a 3 to 4 year period. That's a great opportunity to see a lift in suppliers, opportunities for enterprise development, and we have local content requirements that have gone into our contract obligations. And again, how you manage that to be able to meet timeframes, costs, and in the current environment where there are investors who have got other choices rather than the extractive industry, how do we make it clear that the best return on investment will come from our project? So managing capability, we've been very fortunate to have developed a partnership with the IFC as one of our partners in the Simandou project. Similarly, as the World Bank's been a partner in the Madagascar program. They've brought with them the capacity for training, to build capacity around small and medium enterprises to be directly involved in bidding, considering a process from our procurement point of view. And quite often we talk about the benefits that can come from local supply, and realising that this needs to be first and foremost in the thinking of our procurement team. Our procurement team is driving to reduce costs. They're trying to find other suppliers. And from a community's point of view, I'm saying, well, if you want to continue working, you need to look at building capability into your local supply. And please don't change your mind about where you'll get the supply overnight. Do look at what the long-term response will be if you find a cheaper supplier elsewhere and you withdraw the capacity for this development to occur in country. So there's a fairly robust discussion that happens inside the company for this, because I think most governments, most organisations that look at mining think, well, yes, that's great, there will be a certain number of employees and there'll be a supply line. How then do we get local content? And particularly if there's capacity, if capacity is not at the level where when you move to full project implementation, everybody can get on board quickly with the necessary skills and resources available to them. So I think we've been very fortunate with the IFC as a partner in their development work, but it's not enough. And I think that comes to the challenge of where else we need to work with other partnerships, either through the banking community or other donor groups that are very focused on that enterprise development area, because that's the platform on which you can build other opportunities for development. And quite often that's the area it's not neglected. I think there's a lot of expectation of performance during that time. But it's very hard to get the movement at the front end of a project sufficiently to tie into local supply. And often the investment, and everyone looks at the benefits that will come from the royalty stream as the opportunity for building the communities and the long-term capacity for the enterprise and economy. So that's work that has taken quite a substantial engagement with our businesses, looking at how, from the government's point of view in Guinea, and with our partners, the IFC and Chalco, we're able to mobilise that kind of capacity. Similarly, the work has happened in Richards Bay Minerals, working with other partnerships on enterprise development and considering the opportunities for youth that are obviously knocking at our door with huge expectations of being participants in an environment and a mining industry that is probably reducing the total numbers it employs, because we're seeking to increase innovation, address safety, and find ways in which we can operate more technically in a more efficient manner. Now that requires higher level skills. It doesn't mean the jobs have gone, it just means the jobs have shifted from relatively semi-skilled and technically skilled areas to very highly skilled areas. And so working in partnership with educational programs on vocational training, opportunities for apprentice traineeship programs that will move forward into technical capability, I think are very important. And in looking at what that future might offer for employees, it's not enough to say that there are people who are capable. It's what level of capability and demonstrated networks that they've got to build the next step. And I think certainly in some of the developing environments that we've looked at, how we build that vocational capacity to be able to be at the forefront of employing local youth, I think is really important. I just wanted to really close on the strength of those partnerships. They have to be robust enough to give us a hard time mining industry is usually broad-shouldered, gets fairly hard challenges from the civil society. The really important relationships sit right at the base of the mine, where the communities have come with high expectations, significant influx populations, challenges about conflict on land, the comments that Matt made around resettlement about the land system. We're working in an environment in Guinea specifically focusing on land title within the traditional lineage environment to ensure that we maintain social harmony. Because at the end of the day, whether a mining business goes ahead, whether a project survives, and whether when we leave, the village and the relationships in the social and the community fabric will be what will hold that community together for the long term. And it is a real challenge to be able to seek access to land in a timely manner, with project directors tapping their watch and shaking their fingers and saying, get your team out there more quickly, we need land acquisition, come on. When the whole process requires respectful participation, appropriate engagement, time for people to understand what the consequences will be and how that will actually operate into the future when they make that decision to say, yes, I will stand away from this land and I've got to ensure that I've got sufficient compensation for the short term, but I want to make sure I'm better off in the long term so that I've got better livelihoods. And so part of our planning, particularly in the work we're doing across communities, is to look at the economic investment and benefits. How do we then leverage opportunities with the opening up of infrastructure? So the port around Madagascar, who else can be involved in offering opportunities for growth through agricultural development? In the Guinea environment, along the corridor, it'll be a multi-user rail system, and our economic mapping in terms of opportunities that exist are in the vicinity of $3 billion annually outside of any money that would be generated for the mining industry alone. Now, that won't be something that can be undertaken easily. It's part of the leadership of the government. They're at the forefront of this, but who else comes along as a partner? I think from our perspective, our success in building our long-term involvement in communities and in countries where we mine is how do we work with governments and communities in their partnership to see what their future can be and how they can develop that. We're not the ones that are taking that forward. We're helping to facilitate it, and that changes that dynamic around we're being expected to deliver everything, because we are not anything other than a mining industry with capabilities, no doubt about it. We've got technical capability, we've got a lot of friends, we've got a lot of networks. And those networks need to come in to work in building capacity for people to take their future forward. I'm very happy to take questions, but thank you very much.
Before we move on, you both, I'm going to just plant a seed for later perhaps, but you both touched on the issue around the benefits that flow from local contracting and ensuring that that is optimized. And we had a bit of a discussion this morning as well on the issue of beneficiation and downstream processing. And I often find that governments, including in Canada, that there's a tendency to always focus on that and to overlook where the horizontal opportunities that come from mining. And certainly in the Canadian experience, it has been the horizontal experience, the supply side relationships that have developed in the north at Diavik or the other diamond mines, for example, where we now have $1 billion Aboriginal-owned businesses providing services to multiple operations and penetrating into southern Canada now. It's that part of the equation that I often think governments tend to overlook. And yet, if we look at today, Canada is has the second largest number of mining supply companies in the world. And that's been the enduring and most successful part of, I think, our mining sector, much more so than what you might get from the downstream. And I mean, that's not to say that government should overlook that and change gears. But I often find that, not just governments, but the public can often overlook that there's actually many more and perhaps more larger opportunities that just flow from the sort of the horizontal growth of the business. But maybe we can, I'm throwing that out there so that to maybe prompt some questions and commentary after. But now I'll turn it over to Patricia to sort of introduce Canada's new and improved CSR strategy.
I'm short, so I have to break this down. So thank you to everybody, and thank you to Pierre and the Mining Association of Canada for giving us this time here today. I think that most of you in this room know that natural resources are really key to the Canadian economy. They represent 20% of Canadian GDP, over 50% of our exports. Our extractive industries are active globally. In fact, 831 out of 1,620 mining companies had assets outside of Canada in about 100 foreign countries. Canadian mining assets abroad outstrip those in Canada by almost a factor of 2. So 153.2 billion of assets abroad versus 80.7 billion in Canada. We're in Africa, and in Africa, Canadian mining companies were active in almost 40 countries with total assets of $24.1 billion, slightly more than we had in 2013. So the sector has contributed to major economic and social advances in Canada and continues to do so. Canadian companies have long learned that prosperity of their communities where they operate, we talked about that today, is intimately linked to their own success. And that's why Canadian extractive sector companies have been global leaders in integrating international corporate social responsibility mechanisms into their day-to-day operations, both at home and abroad. So Canada's had a long-standing commitment to CSR. It dates from 1976, when we were an original adherent to the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And since then, we've been a supporter of numerous other CSR mechanisms. In view of the importance of the extractive sector, in 2009, Canada developed a CSR strategy aimed specifically at the extractive sector. And as Pierre mentioned, in November of last year, after extensive consultations, we updated the strategy and it was enhanced. So both the 2009 CSR strategy and the 2014 renewed strategy make clear a fundamental expectation on the part of the Government of Canada. We expect Canadian companies operating abroad to respect human rights and all applicable laws, and to meet or exceed widely recognized international standards for responsible business conduct. For those companies working or exploring opportunities in jurisdictions where local laws are not aligned with Canadian values, we encourage them to find ways to reflect Canadian values that also respect local laws. And if this is impossible, companies might wish to reconsider their investments. Canada, as a country, has strong ties all over the African continent, and development assistance is an integral part of our relationship with the continent. We work in partnership with African leaders on the priorities that they're setting for their countries. Sustainable economic growth is one of those key shared priorities, and the extractive industry represents a potential force for responsible resource development in Africa. Those of you who were here for our breakfast interactive section could see how we interact with some of the governments who are here at Indaba this week. So transparency is an important area for Canada, and one that ensures that the extractive sector can be mutually beneficial. The importance of these transparency to the sector can't be overemphasized, as you heard this morning. Transparency is the foundation for establishing a flourishing business environment where the rules of business are known and enforced. And a number of African countries have been making great strides in this, including by adhering to international standards like the EITI. The Government of Canada recently introduced proposed legislation creating mandatory public reporting of payments to governments and government officials by the extractive sector. the proposed act, entitled the Extractive Sector Transparency Measures Act, is designed to further Canada's fight against corruption by enacting reporting obligations with respect to payments made to both foreign and domestic governments and government officials, eventually including Aboriginal governments. This is part of the CSR strategy. What our consultations on the CSR strategy that occurred over 2013 revealed was that there was increasing recognition by companies of the need to consider CSR in planning and in operations. The role played by government has been to encourage CSR practices and to promote the tools to enhance CSR efforts. So we're confident that this new doing business, the Canadian way, the Canada way, the enhanced CSR strategy, makes clear that government's expectation that the Canadian extractive industries reflect Canadian values in their activities abroad is clear. So the strategy provides a framework to guide efforts to promote CSR policies, tools, and guidance. The enhanced strategy covers 4 broad areas in terms of Government of Canada activities. First, promoting and advancing CSR guidance to Canadian extractive companies abroad. And in this regard, the renewed strategy highlights 6 internationally recognized guidelines. The OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, the voluntary principles on security and human rights, the IFC performance standards on social and environmental sustainability, the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas, and the Global Reporting Initiative. Secondly, we're fostering networks and partnerships, particularly through the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service. And this will include bolstering the capacity of the Trade Commissioner Service to advise Canadian extractive sector companies on a range of CSR mechanisms, issues and approaches, including multi-stakeholder engagement, local procurement, and human resources. Third, we're facilitating dialogue towards disputes resolution. And the new CSR strategy maintains Canada's 2 existing dialogue facilitation mechanisms with some enhancements. The 2 existing mechanisms are the Canadian National Contact Point, established under the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, and the Office of the Extractive Sector CSR Counselor, that was established in 2010. Both mechanisms will continue to have a promotional and an outreach mandate, in addition to dialogue facilitation. Fourth, we're strengthening the environment affecting responsible business practices. Canada undertakes or participates in a broad range of activities whose direct purpose is not to improve private sector CSR practices, but which nonetheless affect how well a company's CSR efforts achieve desired positive outcomes, both internally and for the surrounding area. And such activities include negotiating CSR-related language and free trade agreements, helping build the capacity of local government officials in responsible resource management, and reducing corruption globally. So how has the strategy been enhanced in other ways? The CSR Counselor's Office is going to focus on early-stage dialogue facilitation before disputes escalate into more serious situations. If early-stage dialogue is unsuccessful and formal mediation is required, the CSR Counselor will assist the parties to refer their dispute to the National Contact Point. And participation in both these mechanisms remains voluntary. However, a decision by either party not to participate in CSR Counselor or National Contact Point review processes will now be made public. Alignment by companies of their operations with widely recognized CSR-related guidance, and I mentioned the 6, will now be an eligibility criteria for Government of Canada government services under its economic diplomacy approach. Canadian extractive sector companies that do not participate where requested in either the CSR Counselor or the National Contact Point review processes, or who do not align their operations with international CSR standards will no longer benefit from government economic diplomacy services. So the specific processes by which these changes that I just mentioned will be operationalized are now under development. But it's important to note that decisions to withhold economic diplomacy services won't be taken lightly and will involve a notification period as well as discussions with the company in question. The renewed CSR strategy reflects the importance of the sector to Canada, and it's part of the government's effort to help foster and promote responsible business practices and sustainable economic development, while also providing guidance to companies on managing social and economic risks. So to conclude, there's no doubt that responsibly managed extractive sector, including mining, oil and gas, can accelerate economic growth in ways that benefit all citizens. Corporate social responsibility is central to realizing these benefits and to ensuring sustainable development. And today, thanks to some of the companies we've talked about, Canada is internationally known as an extractive sector leader because of our domestic legal and regulatory framework, which emphasizes environmental protection, safe working conditions, equitable taxation regimes, and consultative processes with local communities. Canadian extractive companies continue to apply that domestic experience in their overseas operations. In light of this, we believe that Canada is well placed to assist African countries to develop and manage their natural resources in a responsible and sustainable way that benefits all of their citizens, particularly those living in poverty. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to turn it over to you, and there's an email or an SMS. Is that going to appear on the screen that people can use if you want to email your question in because you don't want to be seen to be asking it? At the same time, there is a microphone, and we encourage dialogue. And to actually, come clean and say who you are and be visible. But before we do that, I'm going to start, and I'm going to ask Patricia a question. The CSR strategy, when it was announced, the renewed strategy when it was announced recently in November, had the surprising outcome of sort of mining industry support and limited NGO criticism, which doesn't happen very often. In fact, there were even some of our most vocal critics had muted praise for the strategy, which I guess means you've done a lot of the right things. But I think, one of the comments I made at the time, too, was that I thought other countries should take note. Because I think the strategy Canada is now employing is it's a strategy that hopes to enhance the opportunities for Canadian miners abroad by raising the bar, as opposed to what some may say is the conventional approach, which is, let the lowest common denominator prevail, and they're the ones who are going to get the most opportunities. So I guess the question I have is, what response have you received, if you received any, from other governments to the strategy? And are you sort of looking to others, the Australians, the Brits, the Scandinavian countries, some of the other sort of northern mining jurisdictions, the United States? Are they sort of looking to us and saying, well, Canada's just done something, maybe we should emulate and take a similar position?
Don't know if that's working. Yeah. Okay. So thanks, Pierre. I mean, I consider that a pretty softball question. If there are more questions like that, I'm happy to answer them. But honestly, I think a couple of points that you made are are worth reiterating. One is in your opening remarks, you talked about the Mining Association of Canada's own efforts with TSM. I think we're witnessing the industry and government raising the bar. You're raising the bar yourselves. We're raising the bar in terms of transparency. It's pretty clear that we're on the same path because everybody realizes that this has definite mutual benefits. Managing social environmental risk. I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense in terms of good company policy. It makes sense for governments who are interested in prosperity for all their citizens. And, certainly Deputy Minister Oliphant at this morning's breakfast session was a powerful communicator on that score. Whether we've heard from other countries, I think it's a bit new. It was really just November of last year, and some of the details are going to come out in the couple of the next coming weeks. I think that this definitely should be considered part of the Canadian advantage. So doing business the Canadian way should be a Canadian advantage for Canadian extractives companies. We like to see it that way. We think that having that kind of lens where we're concerned about the issues that were raised by my colleagues on the panel, what is sustainable community development that would go beyond the life of a mine? How do you take into consideration fostering businesses and local businesses, which are so important? So these are all things that are worth our continuing to talk about in our part of the Canadian advantage. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we have your microphone over there. First, go ahead. Perhaps introduce yourself.
My name is Peter Fiamo from the Accra office. I'm Trade Commissioner from the High Commission in Accra. Well, I just want to pick up from where we ended up in the earlier session. We had interactive session. I think there was a point that came out saying it looks like the development partners have a role to play in creating a conducive environment for mining investment. I think that directly dovetails into what Janina and Matt were speaking. I think I get the sense that there's now the local content requirements require the capacity of local suppliers to be built. In that case, I think there's a role for development partners to play. I think IFC and a number of development partners have been involved in providing assistance in building the capacity of local suppliers to be able to responsively respond to what you require. Because you have the option of looking outside. And you don't want to be bothering yourself with building a capacity. The development partners can also come in, because I see that as an opportunity for development partners to also play a role in the process.
Maybe I'll ask Janina, it wasn't in your bio, but I discovered this while we were chatting before the session. Before you worked in mining, you worked in the development.
Was it community?
Yes, development world. So perhaps I'll ask you to take that on first.
I think this is one of the challenges in any project discussion, both from a government point of view and from developers. Who takes the accountability for building the capacity for small and medium enterprise, large enterprise for that matter in the country, to take the next steps? We invested extensively, particularly around the compensation associated with our livelihoods with the land acquisition, to set up people's bank accounts, because people didn't have access to banking. Required us then to go through engagement with a number of banks to look at who was in a position to actually provide good financial literacy in development, and then establish the banking system that people could access largely by mobile phones anywhere in the country. When we were looking at the enterprise opportunities that arise out of supply lines, the real issue was people's capacity to get credit. And credit's not readily available. Now we can provide, and it's not just a case that we might find in an African country situation. We have had the same situation in working with indigenous suppliers in Australia as well. How do they demonstrate that they've got the potential for a contract with a large supplier to supply a large company like ours, and get the necessary front-end investment to purchase equipment? That requires them also to understand the risks associated with that. Now, if banks are going to act on provision of credit but then withdraws support in tough times, then we start to see some of the sine waves that we've seen elsewhere in the finance industry. So how then do we start to have that sort of dialogue? And my experiences have been that everyone wants the development project to go ahead, but there are some precursors in this space. Who are the players that have got the opportunity to take that forward? I think that there are opportunities for investment in the banking sector to consider that they also wear some of the pain and opportunity. The opportunity that comes with the investment opportunity for the growth, but also how do they contribute to offering credit in environments where people have not necessarily had ready access to credit? How do you build a bank for people to say, yes, I can draw upon that as I build my business? Because it's a bit difficult if everyone stands back and says, well, we'll wait till you get the big investors, and then when you all come to town, it's all obviously tick and we'll run away and we'll all make money out of this, and that there'll be benefit. When in fact there are a number of small buildings, there are a number of building blocks that need to go into place. And I think we've seen that with the IMF, we've seen that with the World Bank, who come in and spend a lot of time working on the capacity building around financing and transparency. But that is not the only space that we need to be talking about. And I don't have enough background in the financial sector, but I do know that there's a gap that currently exists, because we've certainly been challenged by that in terms of looking at potential suppliers who need to get access to credit and know that they've got 2 or 3 years ahead of them of support from that banking sector to be able to provide the necessary liquidity to make the opportunity work for them.
Yeah, I mean, the financing of those sort of things obviously a very important aspect. I think, again, talking from the experience in Congo and in Zambia, before that can happen, the government has to provide an environment that enables those things to happen. There's a lot of discussion. Pierre's point earlier about downstream or side stream, upstream beneficiation. It's all very well talking about downstream beneficiation, but you then don't allow land title for the person to come and build the refinery or whatever. It doesn't matter whether you have access to finance or not under that situation, because the investor is just not going to take that step. I think on that point of Pierre's, there's a lot of pressure, obviously, to take the copper that's produced in Zambia to some further product, and that means cable or piping, basically. And if you were to do that in Zambia, there is the market for that in Zambia is not even 5% of the production. So it means you're now exporting cable instead of mass copper. You don't know. We're a mining company. We don't have any expertise in selling cable. Is it 1 millimeter cable everybody wants, or 10 millimeter cable? Is it armored cable? Whatever. You see, that's somebody else's business, and that should be taken care of by somebody else, not by the mining company. That's not what mining companies are good at. It's much more important, in our view, that the supply side is taken care of. So, like mill balls, we consume a huge amount of mill balls. To encourage somebody to come into Zambia and build a mill ball factory or an explosive factory or whatever else it is, it's so important to have that investment, because in our view, and I don't think it's our view, I think it's a axiomatic law, that jobs are only created by private sector investment. There is no other mechanism by which jobs are created. And it's only by sustaining those investments that you sustain those jobs, and it's only by having new investment that you create new jobs. It's almost, there's not a government in the world that doesn't come to power on the promise that it's going to create a whole lot of jobs. But governments don't create jobs. In a very cynical way, my view would be that governments create employment. But everybody who's employed by the government is paid ultimately by private sector taxes. So the key issue is to get private sector to invest, and to do that, the governments have to create an environment that allows that to happen and makes that easy. That's so important. So once that's done, then obviously the funding issues and who's prepared to put forward the financing is critical. Johannesburg is a classic example of a city that started as a small mining town. The mines have long since been depleted, but over the early decades of the existence of Johannesburg, an environment existed whereby hotels, banks, manufacturing industries, service industries of all descriptions were created. So now the mines have closed, but Johannesburg's the biggest financial center in Africa. And so that's what's so important, is while those mines are in existence, for an environment to be created or enabled by the government that allows all those other support industries and secondary and tertiary industries to develop. That's the only way that community can be sustained once the mine closes, which inevitably it will, possibly with the exception of some of Rio Tinto's iron ore mines in Western Australia.
Did I see Matt wanting to jump in? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Pierre. And, I got a little bit of my name is Matthew Bliss. I'm with Cordaid. Cordaid's a Dutch-based NGO, and I'm with their extractives team. I used to be with mining companies, so I've only been an NGO for 1 year, so I'll try to represent the constituency. Talking with Greg before we started gave me the confidence to ask this. I don't know if it's a silly question or for me, sometimes it feels like the question. But you guys have really made me kind of excited and scared to give examples of platforms and examples of where we're starting to do state building. These are some of the foundation blocks for state building. But as all the multi-stakeholders or different multi-stakeholders represented, communities, governments, companies, to what extent do we work together? To what extent do we oppose each other or provide critical feedback when you're building a CSR policy, for example, in Canada, to allow some of those strategic things to come out? Both Janina and Matt have mentioned small things that are actually quite large. Pierre mentioned that a mine is the equivalent of an Olympics a day. So obviously we have a platform for helping an economy grow and leave something that's better after we're done. But to what extent can we be explicitly doing that? I think as an NGO, if we want a big impact, if together we want to make a big difference, we have to be thinking that way. But we need to work together, because sometimes the difficulty is a disconnect between the national government and the local government. So I'm just wondering, to what extent do we participate together in that? Do we be explicit in that to help there be enough, to empower communities enough to engage in these discussions and to help them also engage with their local governments? A company can't do that. A government can't do that alone. Communities and NGOs can't do that alone. I know this is a theme that comes up often, but I just thought I'd throw that out there as something maybe we can address as part of our closing remarks. If you want to jump in, I saw a few snarls, so please let me know what that means.
Well, there's, as Matt knows, in Canada now for the good maybe a decade or so, there's been a group called the Devonshire Initiative, which started off rather informally, but is now sort of its own entity. And what it was a bringing together of development NGOs, like your own, though I don't know if you're a member, but you're welcome to be. You're Dutch, so maybe not. And mining companies. And it started off as a very interesting exercise of trust building. And I remember that one of the very first meetings of this group was each side sort of presented the caricature of the other, from their respective communities. And then started to break that down. And now it's led to a number of different partnerships between those different members in different parts of the world. And I think a growing recognition that that's the way of the future. But I don't know if others want to touch on. I imagine you both have NGO partners at your different sites, and maybe reflect on those types of partnerships.
Well, we certainly have a number of partnerships, and I think the starting point is that civil society is an important part of representing the interests of communities, and the balancing act is ensuring that you have robust dialogue. And I think as a result of the engagement of civil society, concerns that mining and extractive industry are not listening has led to some of the strategy that Canada's put in place in relation to its CSR, and indeed the standards that exist around the IFC standards for social and environmental performance. I think you raise the challenge is who then takes the lead. Well, ultimately government's responsible because it's the sovereign nation. How then do you work together without stepping on each other's toes and recognising that we're not government? But if there's to be a capacity building exercise so that governments can mobilise to be able to take advantage of a development, for example, that's a network that exists within governments and governance relationships who can provide that support. It's a combination of other governments, such as through the Canadian government or the Australian government or other nations, and then civil society capability. I mean, one of our opportunities but challenges is to look at those partnerships to build a local capability, not to have a third-party NGO establishing and setting up a beachhead, if you like, to become the nation, the national voice. But how do they empower the local community to be at the forefront of conflict prevention when things are getting out of hand and there's going to be a rapid escalation? There are mechanisms that exist within that local community, but they may not have been readily supported and articulated sufficiently for them to step forward in difficult times. So it's that, and quite often I think the NGO, the donor the donor community comes knocking on the doors of large operations such as ours, and I'm very pleased in many of our engagements, particularly as we've undertaken long land access negotiations and settled with groups such as the Nunavut and so on, and the Aboriginal communities in Australia. We don't make the decisions about which NGOs will go into those communities. That's a decision for that community to make. No longer my role to be sitting and choosing, that one will be the education one and that one will be the health one. It's, well, what's going to work at this local level? And I think that that's really part of the shift that's occurring as well, in terms of the empowering of the local voices. People have always sorted out their business. They can do it, create blockades, or they can do it in reasonably pleasant. They can get a result, or they can engage with the government to set new rules. But those systems are in play, and from our perspective in the community's work, we've worked with partnerships at the local level to try and build that change, but not take that responsibility. We're trying to stay within our space.
I guess, being a cynic, probably, and just a mining engineer, you get NGOs and NGOs.
Those go hand in hand.
Yeah. I mean, there are some NGOs who do take the interests of the community very seriously and do a good job. I think there are also some NGOs that have a bandwagon, and the last thing they want to see is actually have that problem fixed, because then they wouldn't have a job anymore. So I think one of the important things is to identify those who genuinely do have the interests of the community at heart, and to work with those. But I think Janina says it's really, we don't try and manage their involvement with the community. But it's important that one does have dialogue with them, and that one does try to get to, if you will, have some kind of educational input there. And because some of the NGOs, their demands and so on are completely unrealistic, and they're obviously, they appear to be a sort of knee-jerk reaction to almost political pressures. So the church groups in Zambia, for argument's sake, will continually be bringing up issues like the tax rate should be increased. Well, when you're already the highest tax base metal mining country in the world, at some point it just makes the mining operation unviable, which we're now unfortunately beginning to see. So it's very important to try and be involved in a process where one gets a high level of realism and positive input from the NGOs for the benefit of their constituency, as it were, rather than some bandwagon that they might be pushing.
Patricia, to bring you into this, the Government of Canada's also sort of shifted its strategy in recent years, not without some controversy, around investing through its development arm in sort of NGO mining sector strategies. Do you want to comment on sort of how, on that strategy and what you're seeking to do? It's not unique to Canada, actually. Canada's sort of late to the game. The United Kingdom and the Americans and the Germans have been doing this for many years. But I guess being sort of one of the centers for, with the largest number of mining companies, we tend to attract a bit more attention perhaps around these strategies, so there's been some controversy.
Sure. Well, I think that we've seen a couple of different models, Pierre. We've seen a couple of models where our mining companies have worked on the food security question, some in the area of which they were mining, others not necessarily in that same area. But there's some really also interesting examples of mining companies working in a different way with partnerships and with local communities on, for example, looking at the curriculum that mining colleges might be working on. So, is that curriculum modern enough? Is it relevant enough? Would it produce the kind of people that companies could hire? So I think this is the kind of thing we're actually doing in Canada domestically. We're talking about private sector getting more involved in that skills development and making sure that that kind of upfront work is put into producing the kinds of graduates that industry would want to take. So that's an interesting area. Also through our development program for Africa, because as PANAF DG, there's a program under me now called Exceed. And this will be a program that looks at projects that are multi-country. It's not necessarily one country. And it will have 3 prongs. One is the building capacity in national governments, to look at some of the work they're doing with the extractive sector. One part of that will be working with, in terms of building capacity in local communities, the kinds of things that people have been talking about. How do you structure dialogues? How do you do consultations? What kind of capacity building do we have to do in the local community? And the third part of it is, how do you build capacity in local business? So all 3 of those will be looked at through the Succeed program.
Hi, my name is Jeff Geipel. I'm with Engineers Without Borders, and I run a project called Mining Shared Value, which the main focus is promoting local procurement by the mining industry. So I'm obviously thrilled that that's been such a common topic on the panel, and I'll repeat my kudos to the government for including local procurement in the CSR strategy. Janina, I was really struck by your comment about how, if you want to continue to work here, you're going to have to build capacity in your local supply chain. And I'm wondering how you have made that case sort of to your shareholders internally, because it's the kind of argument that we've been making to companies for a long time, and yet at the site level, at the corporate level, a lot of companies just don't see that as a business case. So I'd be very curious to know your thoughts on the business case for long-term local procurement.
I have a number of battle scars. Look, it's a dialogue like any business discussion. The business is interested in continuing to grow and thrive. It depends on what happens at the leadership level as well. If I give you an example of what was done in Western Australia around our Pilbara area, then I perhaps can identify that. Sam Walsh, when he came in to be Chief Executive of the iron ore business, before he went on to become our Chief Executive for the business, took the supply issue as a very strong commitment. And we were, one of the big challenges in Western Australia was there was a view that the East Coasters, a long way away on the other side of the country, were coming in, taking advantage of the growth and development in the West Coast and reinvesting it somewhere else other than in Western Australia. That was the general dialogue. That seems to be a bit of what happens in these large countries, East and West, not always aligned. And so one of the commitments that was made was around local supply, and that doesn't mean that there's necessarily a better break opportunity for local supply, but because it's about how do we grow together. And it was not necessarily in the good times that was put in place, and so procurement was given quite clear directions to focus on trying to find local supply in the midst of the global development, which was saying procurement has to be maximised in terms of, you have to minimise costs and maximise benefits. So you've got these two wheels working, sometimes in harmony and sometimes grinding a little bit. But I think that the fundamental was that if we would invest in local business, and when we looked at working on Indigenous business, and we have signed agreements in our contracting obligations with local Indigenous business, we had to identify what that meant. So how do we, postcode, it's the number of representatives who are on the board, so it's not tokenism in terms of, we've got a few people that we think are local, and that it was seen to be recognised locally as a supplier as well. And so after, I think I went to one of the supply awards events, and of course they were all tied to our safety awards as well, and our performance in health, environment and communities as well, so that their performance is looked at, and their capacity to be local employers was very important too. And I think that more than we've been going for a decade, the sense of pride of those suppliers, a room filled with about 80 or 90 of the suppliers, probably several thousand that are networked, but they had come to be part of this event, and they had been through the good times and the bad. They'd seen the opportunities. They certainly didn't feel as though they'd been given lots of favours from time to time because we were cutting costs. But we valued their participation, and they were growing and building a local economy. And I think that from the sort of the top down, and then working across the collegiate group inside the business, all right, well, which of these opportunities will we look at joint venturing? Because quite often a small start-up business is never going to have that opportunity, and we as a large company have to trust that they'll supply in the time frame. And interestingly, we had some of the North American Native American group coming from Alaska knocking on the door to say they were going to start partnerships with the Aboriginal groups that have been fostered through the American government, as it happens, because they had such good joint venture partners that they looked at working with our network as well. So it's a bit of innovation, so fairly hard yards, and then when the decision is that we're going to change some of the arrangements for payments to suppliers, it's always useful to talk to somebody in the communities because they'll bear the pain. And if you want to have that not just become a major issue, how do you manage that transition? And it's a constant dialogue. I don't think that there's any time in which I could say, yes, right, local content policy, done, end of story. No. There's a debate. Is it targeted? Do we have targets? In some places, no. But there's a requirement to demonstrate that you will employ locally. In other places, we've got contractual obligations for targets. So then we drive to deliver. And I think it really requires a lot of leadership at the most senior levels, but capacity being built inside the business to be able to be innovative in the constrained times as well.
How effective are targets? Do you find better performance with sites that have targets, or actually does that create its own set of problems, different problems?
I work in the mining industry. As far as I understand, we drive for performance. The only way you drive for performance is targets.
I thought that would be the answer, but I thought I'd ask. Anyone else want to? No? Got another question over there?
Yes, hello. Ginette Martin, Canadian ambassador in the Congo. I have been in several continents, and I must say that over the years I have seen and recognized the excellence of Canadian companies in their CSR policies. And I think that we've come a long way, and we really have a model that is delivering. My concern is about the competition. And I'm wondering, because of course one bad actor in the field is going to have the impact of tarnishing the whole business, and that's really, I think, where the NGOs that are, I agree with you, there are some NGOs that are doing this as a business and don't want to continue that. That's where they will focus, of course, is if they see one bad actor in the field, they will then use it to criticize the whole mining industry. And I'm just wondering whether within, I also have seen over the past little while increasing sharing of best practices and knowledge, experience, expertise between companies. And I think that's another very positive development. What I am wondering about is about self-policing, whether there is an effort within the mining community in their particular areas where they're working to try to work with those neighboring companies about their CSR practices and to try to have an influence in that regard.
To give my colleagues time to think about this, I'll just comment on our Towards Sustainable Mining initiative in Canada, which I mentioned at the beginning. So what it does is our member companies at all of their Canadian operations evaluate their performance and report against it with third-party verification brought in every 3 years. So what that has done, it's not policing, and we actually at the association have to remind our members, who sometimes think we are police, as we ask them for their results, that we're not. I mean, that's not our role at all. And it would be an awkward place for us to go into. But the public reporting of results does a number of things. First of all, and we've seen this, member companies see how each other is doing across the suite of indicators. And it invariably leads to phone calls between companies saying, I see you've really put in an effective energy management system. We've been really struggling in that area. How have you done it? And it has fostered a kind of sharing and collaboration across the sector that we didn't used to see nearly as much. So that's one thing. And then, of course, the public disclosure of performance provides communities with a lens into how their companies are doing vis-a-vis others. And that creates incentives for companies to improve their performance as well. So it's there is different ways of sort of bringing pressure to bear, I think, constructively as opposed to policing to improve performance.
Firstly, I'd just like to say that we had a number of problems in the Congo, and the Canadian ambassador at the time and the Canadian diplomatic community, even back in Canada, were incredibly steadfast and supportive, and we've always had a lot of admiration for the stance they took in that whole debacle. There was an NGO, I think they still operate, called Action Aid, who had taken a stance against the mining industry as a whole. And we, sort of going back to the point I made earlier, we were able to dialogue with them. And in the end, they actually saw where the pressures were coming from, became very supportive, and as a result, they're supportive of our efforts, but also quite even more critical of the efforts made by some other companies who were obviously had taken a different route to remain in the DRC. But in the Zambian context, there's not a lot of dialogue around those issues, but you do, and what one would always be careful of is that you're not to sort of, we build more schools than you do, or we supply more antiretrovirals than you do, as a sort of, it's not a competition. One's out there really trying to respond to the needs of the community in which you operate more specifically. And so where in Zambia you've got many of the mines are still associated with the old major towns, Chingola, Kitwe and so on. The imperatives there are quite different to those in a new environment that we find ourselves out further west, where there are no schools. In Kitwe and so on, there are schools, but they may need some help. So, but it may be the medical side that is more defunct and needs support. So I think most of the companies in Zambia have taken a pretty responsible view on what their particular communities require, and therefore they've pursued that. It's obviously a real concern going forwards that right at the moment, as I said, we have a mineral royalty tax that effectively takes no cognizance of any capital expenditure or in fact any expenditure. It just looks at your revenue. Now, again, being a bit cynical, one of the things about CSR is it's one way of a company getting the government to actually unknowingly do something for the community in your area, because to the extent that you're spending money there, you're getting a tax deduction, and therefore to a certain extent the government's also playing a role there. With the mineral royalty tax, that obviously falls away, and one would just hope that it doesn't impact very negatively on the amount of spend that takes place in that area, in the CSR area, because there's no recognition for that in basically the company's financial return. So under pressure, we might find that some of the mines are underwater. There's no question. At the current copper price and current royalty regime, they're underwater. And therefore, one just worries that some of the good things that have been done in CSR might be impacted and cut back.
I think are we? Yes, we're nearing a close, so I'm going to, at this point, just ask Greg to come up and make some closing remarks. And before he does that, I also just want to thank our panelists for participating today, and for the audience for engaging with us over the course of the morning.
Okay. Well, thank you, Pierre. It's a great honor to be with all of you today. As some of you may have heard me mention in the event prior to this one, I'm newly arrived to Africa, having spent for the last 16 years in Asia, the last place, Mongolia, which those of you like Matt who know Mongolia know it has its own sort of challenging resource development dynamic, I suppose you'd say. Rio Tinto would know all about that. I'm not sure whether I should feel reassured by this or distressed by this, but a lot of the themes we've touched on today are ones that are very familiar to me and certainly span Asia, Africa, and I suspect elsewhere as well. I guess the conclusion that I take away from today's session is that while many of the broad challenges of resource development enterprises that face are the same globally, those challenges vary in their particulars according to the geographic location and the project, as do their solutions, I suppose. And in crafting those solutions, there needs to be a role for companies, for business, for government, and for the local communities. Take any one of those three legs of the stool away, and the enterprise will either fall over or at the very least not function as well as it could. So CSR is not easy. It's very complex. It's very hard. Getting that balance of those three legs is not necessarily an easy one, but it's certainly a necessary one. One of the figures that we heard, I think, from Peter Leon this morning in the first session was that on average, the cost of getting it wrong, in terms of the conflict between local communities and businesses, can be as much as $20 million a week. Did I get that figure right?
Is it a day?
A day? Something? Week, day. Whatever, week or day, I personally would notice $20 million, disappearing. So it's important. I find that oftentimes the discussion about between companies and government and local communities devolves to questions of like who owns the resource, with each side, and it ultimately devolves down to David and Goliath kinds of discussions between the parties in which everybody regards the other person as Goliath, the rapacious people who are out to get us kind of thing. And that's in cases where your situation isn't abetted, as we mentioned this morning, by third parties who maybe have no particular interest in seeing it ever get resolved at all. So managing the caricature, managing the expectations in a transparent way becomes very, very important. That's one of my takeaways this morning. And there are lots of ways to own a mine. You can own it through supply chains, you can own it through royalties and taxes, and it doesn't have to be just looking at equity. I guess my final takeaway is that we as Canadians have a capacity, a capability, and therefore I think an obligation in the projects we're promoting, whether those projects are in Canada or in other partner countries, to bring world-class best practice in terms of responsible and sustainable mining. Not to impose our model, I would say, or any model on those partner countries, but to adapt what we've learned in Canada and elsewhere to local conditions. And that, I think, is really at the heart of our renewed CSR strategy, I would say. So for my part, I learned a great deal this morning. I want to thank the panelists for your time and insights today. And I want to thank all of you for having been a part of this particular discussion this morning. And I wish you all a very productive Mining Indaba. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Coming. That's very good.
Thank you. I'll now.
So, Director, are you essentially the Chief Operating Officer?
No.